Hey everyone, Two Angry Frogs here, and with the War Within now upon us, we're taking a look back at Dragonflight to give our thoughts on the expansion. What were the high marks and what were the low marks? Where would we like to see things improved? Has Dragonflight set a good foundation going into the War Within? Let's talk about all this and get your thoughts as well. But before we begin, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you always know what we're up to next. Now, let's get into it. So as far as story, overall I would put Dragonflight as a middle-of-the-road expansion as it pertains to storytelling. The story, while leaps and bounds ahead of Shadowlands, was not particularly memorable. Although there were some highlights with the campaign, such as the interactions between Kalecgos and the Tuskarr, I still find the most memorable moments and best storytelling to be among some of the side quests. Sitting on the edge of the Ruby Life Shrine and listening to Veritastraz tell of the Dragon Wars, or watching the Ruby Whelpling leave with Duros Scaletaker after the quest line of the Dragonmaw clan was completed, had some incredibly emotional storytelling, and I found these types of moments to be the best. I would love to see the campaign quest lines have more of these types of moments going into the War Within. When it comes to world events, there was some good and some bad. There was definitely fun to it when Dragonflight was first released, and community feasts were packed with Yes Chef, and we did have some very unique events, such as the Scarab Vaults and building out our Onyx Annular Ring. But these events became recurring themes throughout the entire expansion. Each patch would bring a new world event, and although maybe interesting in its own right, it led to all previous events becoming obsolete and pretty much just filling our map with icons of left-behind content. The world events did provide an avenue for solo players to gear up without the need to run dungeons and raids, which was a positive. But the limiting factor for these events was not really the challenge of the event itself, but rather being in the game at a specific hour or half-hour interval. I do hope for the War Within we see less of these, and Blizzard has indicated in past interviews that stacking world events is not something they want to do going forward. In their place, let's see more interesting gameplay options that have a bit more challenge to them. Is that what delves are intended to do? Possibly. Only time will tell. Before we leave this topic, speaking of the Scarab Vaults and the Onyx Amulet, this is a perfect example of how Blizzard could do legendaries in the future. The ring was not difficult to get, but it took quite a bit of effort to get it to maximum item level with optimal primordial gems. Getting the ring itself did not require winning the lottery. The argument against a weapon being unique because it is legendary could be applied to the effect on the legendary and not the weapon itself. So for example, make it so that you have to complete a series of difficult tasks before the effect on the legendary activates. The legendary itself is not difficult to get, rather activating the legendary effect becomes the challenge. For me, a big winner in Dragonflight was the gear upgrade system introduced in patch 10.1. The new system simplified upgrading gear to two types of currency, flight stones and crests, and the ability to upgrade gear was based on the type and level of content you were doing, so that made a whole lot of sense. The gearing system did have a learning curve and some confusion around it at first, but outside of changing the names of the various levels of crests, it has stayed consistent and common throughout the expansion. I know there were a lot of complaints about the cap on flight stones, but it did introduce some decision making when it came to what to upgrade and when. The Revival Catalyst I also thought was a big win. Regardless of the level of content that you played or your luck, or not luck, in getting the rolls for tier and raid, you had a safety net in the Revival Catalyst to get your tier set within a given amount of time. Season 1, I had some really bad RNG, and it took me quite a bit of time to get the 4-piece tier, whereas Season 2, I had great RNG and had it within 3 weeks. But either way, I knew at a given point in time, I would have enough catalyst charges to finish out the 4-piece. One thing the gearing upgrade system brings, which I think is missing in parts of WoW content, is the feeling of progression and accomplishment. When you finish upgrading your gear to the overall character item level you're shooting for, there is a sense of achievement. The WoW team, over the course of Dragonflight, have tried to time gate gearing at various paces, and have hopefully found a good balance between gearing that is too slow versus too fast. Because honestly, if everything is given to us as players in the first 2 weeks of the season, what is left to accomplish? There should be a sense of progression and knowing your character is continuing to gain in power to take on the next level of content. Another big win, at least for me, was the return of talent trees. As a player when WoW first launched, this was a welcome return to the days of old. Granted, there have been some missteps along the way, and in some instances, talent trees have been hard to traverse to get to the playstyle you want. They also have had pretty much meaningless talents at times. But the talent trees have definitely improved over time and are continuing to improve going into the War Within. They're not perfect, but it is a long way from what we had in Shadowlands, which was for the most part, pick and forget it for the rest of the season. For professions, it was another case of some good and some bad. The new profession system brought in some changes, such as specialization trees, that drove decision making as far as where we were going to focus first when it came to spending those precious knowledge points. The addition of profession gear, secondary stats, and special items such as sparks did introduce some interesting ways to think about crafting as well. For the not so good, the public crafting order system definitely fell short. It was not used to the extent that it could have been, and for the most part, players simply advertised in trade chat as opposed to using the built-in system. Unfortunately, the public crafting order system also developed many times into just orders attempting to scam players out of gold. The second thing that fell short was the randomness of crafting with inspiration. The ability of one crafter over another to make the highest level of crafted gear was left to luck of the roll early on in the expansion. It does look like both these shortcomings are being addressed in the War Within, with concentration replacing inspiration and the introduction of NPC crafting orders. So I think we will see a lot of improvement in crafting, which is a great step forward. Another big win in Dragonflight was the introduction of edit mode. Many players, including myself, found enough functionality to drop other add-ons and just use the in-game edit mode for setting up our user interfaces. There are some areas that I think we could use finer control over, such as sizing some of the user interface elements and more options for raid frames. But overall, the functionality is a really good starting point, and I do expect the WoW team to expand on edit mode as we move into new expansions and patches. Continuing with the big wins are guilds, specifically the introduction of cross-faction guilds in patch 10.1. Be honest, this has been in the making for a long time. Blizzard tried it with communities, which did not really provide what was needed, and this just put another hurdle in place in being able to seamlessly play together. With cross-faction added, no longer were we confined to playing only one faction or the other to be able to take part in content with our guilds. And with warbands in place now, we have cross-realm guilds, which takes a step further and continues to open up player interaction without the limits we were used to dealing with. Now we just need updates to the guild interface to make it easier to manage and get the information we need when it comes to running a guild. Maybe we'll see that in the War Within. For Dungeons and Mythic Plus, I think we had some wins and losses. The changing dungeon pool is definitely a win in my opinion. We have left behind running the same 8 dungeons for 2 years to having a good mix of old and new dungeons, giving a little more variety from season to season. The biggest loss by far were the Mythic Plus affixes. We had affixes such as Afflicted and Incorporeal that locked out certain classes or specs, or made it so that certain specs could basically make them non-affixes. And we had the Season of Mass Dispel, which pretty much did the same thing. As we have neared the end of the expansion, however, the WoW team has made fundamental changes to Dungeons and Mythic Plus, which has been for the better. We had the complete revamp of Mythic Plus Keystone levels, changes to Heroic and Mythic Dungeons, and changes to the reward system. As we look forward to the War Within, we're seeing the current affix system completely retired in favor of Xal'atath's Bargain and some other interesting mix-ups. So it does look to be continuing to move in a positive direction. When it comes to raiding, overall I thought it was pretty good. We had some interesting new bosses and boss mechanics, and the raids were themed pretty cool. The boss difficulty, for the most part, was tuned pretty well. That is, until you reach the final 2 of each raid. And for me, the biggest issue here is not that the bosses themselves were overly difficult, but rather the continuation of raid wipe mechanics that are reliant on 20 players performing perfectly. And this design, unfortunately, is driven by the highest level players as the WoW team continues the arms race with the race to world first guilds. This is an issue that still has not been resolved. I understand the desire to release incredibly difficult content, but the reduction in that difficulty for the rest of us mere mortals took longer than it likely should have, especially with Emir Drasil. The introduction of the Severed Strands raid buff, if it remains and is available when the War Within launches, might be a partial solution. With this, a raid team can collect Narubar finery from raid bosses and turn those in for a stackable damage or healing buff when inside the raid. With this buff, however, Blizzard will need to walk a very fine line between making raid content too easy and overly difficult. Finally, we had two big content additions for the end of expansion, including Plunder Storm and Mists of Pandaria Remix. To say there was some player opinion around these would be a massive understatement. While I did collect everything for Plunder Storm, the gameplay loop did get grindy very quickly. I think this was exacerbated by the fact that we had a single map for the mode, and the best way to collect currency was basically anti-gameplay. Collect as much as possible, get in the storm and die, and re-queue. Not exactly a great way to play a game. For MOP Remix, it was a very interesting way to revive older content, and I do expect that we will see more of this in the future. I very much enjoyed Remix for the first 4 to 5 weeks, but it as well became more anti-gameplay. As Remix moved forward, there was very little social interaction, and getting through content as fast as possible seemed to be the goal. My biggest complaint by far, and this also goes into the pre-patch, is that the game over the last 3 months or so has felt like nothing but a collection machine. Collect more pets, collect more mounts, collect more transmog, and then collect some more. I know there are players that love this, but for me, I honestly do not need another 50 mounts that I will never use. Overall, Dragonflight did do the one thing that was needed more than anything else, and that was to stop the bleeding after Shadowlands. The player base has grown throughout the expansion and looks to be poised to grow further going into the War Within, which I think we can all agree is good for the game. Overall, the systems and game mechanics had some hits and misses, but systems such as the new gearing upgrades, edit mode for the user interface, and cross-faction and cross-realm guilds were a great step forward. So what are your takeaways as we leave Dragonflight? What were the hits and misses in your view? As always, give us your thoughts down below in the comments, and everyone, have a great day.